increasing agricultural productivity, which was aimed at increasing agricultural productivity. It involved a forced collectivization of farms, which was meant or aimed at increasing agricultural productivity. However, the forced collectivization was bitterly opposed by the peasantry as well as the rich peasants, or who were also called as the kulaks, K-U-L-A-K. However, the forced collectivization was bitterly opposed by the peasantry as well as the rich kulaks, and this resulted in large-scale violence in the rural countryside. This resulted in large-scale violence in the rural countryside. Also, the collectivization failed to increase productivity from 1928 to 1937, as a number of peasants left agriculture to move to urban centers for jobs. New farm equipments were only slowly introduced. Etc. Thus, the collectivization program could not bring about any positive turnaround of agriculture till 1937. Now, the other thing that we talk about is Stalin's industrial policies. Stalin's industrial policies. And talking about Stalin's industrial policies, we see Stalin moved the Soviet Union towards a state-led model of industrialization with the introduction of 5-year plans, or Gosplan, from 1928 to 1941. a number of heavy industries were set up during this period. Industrial production increased significantly, leading to an increase in worker wages and a drop in unemployment. Moreover, as the Soviet Union moved towards rapid industrial growth, the Western world was dealing with the perils of capitalism, that is, the Great Depression. Thirdly, Stalin's political policies. Stalin's extremely authoritarian regime tolerated little or no political dissent, as a other political parties except the Communist Party was made or was except the Communist Party were declared illegal. B, what you also see is Stalin resorted to the great purges from 1934 to 38, where he wiped out his political opponents both within and outside the Communist Party. Anyone even mildly critical of Stalin or the Communist Party was forced into labor camps or jail or assassinated. So that was the authoritarian nature of his political policies. Finally, what you see is the social impact of these policies. In terms of the social impact of these policies, what you see is the 1928 to 1941 period saw a number of social changes, such as everybody's written this much? If you, okay. If you've not, please increase your writing speed. Okay. Now, 1928 to 41 period saw a number of social changes such as A, an increase in the labor force participation. Just to give you a sense, labor force participation rate in India currently is not even 24%. Of women labor force participation in India currently is not even 24%. They had 24% then, and then they increased it to 40. That's also, and you know, this is India's, you know, the irony. This just reminds me of another thing. You know, is when you look at labor force participation of women, it's considered also as a very good contraceptive. It's also considered something that increases women bargaining position within the family, a more important control of women over their own reproductive rights. Okay, that the more is the participation of women in the labor force, there is also going to be later childbearing and limited childbearing. Okay, and that happens because women recognize their own, obviously, economic potential and thus have a major say in the decision making within the family also. It also reminds me of the fact that India was one of the first countries, it was the first country in the world to introduce what? The family planning program. And yet, we have miserably failed in that. And yet, you have another major individual who leaves her mark wherever she goes. Who are we talking about? Yeah. So, as long as she finally made her first ministerial move in higher education, from the Ministry of Education to now the Ministry of Broadcasting, right? The 6 to 10 a.m., the 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. ban, because probably condoms are not sanskari. Okay? And that is a reflection of how, you know, this is the politics of sexuality in India, as I always say. In India, the politics of sexuality can only take the society down. It can never be a mature conversation. Sex education is something that has been roundly debated about in government education policies time and again, and has been rebuffed primarily because it would offend the sensitivities of the people. Okay, now you don't even, so people have no way to get sex education while they are adolescents in school. On television, you don't allow ads of contraception. What does that leave people with? And India also, incidentally, is the world's capital of not rape, unsafe abortions. We have the world's highest number of unsafe abortions. Okay, and so that goes to show that there is absolutely nothing in terms of reproductive education. On top of that, you can allow ads of everything, but not something that is related to sexuality. So, हमारे यहाँ मैं तो कहता हूँ, that's why I say, the current Prime Minister started from ना खाऊंगा ना खाने दूंगा. Now, and this was doing the rounds when the Gujarat election and Hardik Patel issue came. कि ना करूंगा ना करने दूंगा. So, I mean, that's a reflection of the fact that sexuality is something that is either to be repressed or something to be not talked about. Who is the ideal prime minister जिसने शादी नहीं करी, जिसके बच्चे नहीं हैं? So, if you do शादी and बच्चा, probably you're not a very good prime minister. How does that anyway translate into a reality? So, that's a very major problem, and that is why one of the positives of the social, that is why one of the positives of the Russian Revolution was considered that even till 1990, in terms of gender equality, apart from obviously very other negatives also, but at least in terms of gender equality and some other spheres, the Soviet Union was far ahead of the West. Okay, that's actually that much was there. So 1928 to 41 saw a number of social changes such as increase in labor force participation of women from 24% in 1928 to 39% in 1940. B, there was an increase in worker wages and a decline in unemployment. Also, the universalization of primary education was started from 1929 onwards for those above 8 years of age. So, the social impact of this period was relatively positive that we see. So these are all Stalin's policy, and in conclusion, we can say that Stalin's rule from 1928 till 1953 was responsible for rapid industrialization of Russia and a relatively positive social impact upon gender equality was also witnessed. However, even though Stalin consolidated the hold of Communist Party over Russia, his extremely authoritarian rule as visible in the Great Purges meant that Russia under Stalin was an undemocratic country with little respect for individual freedom. So that much is there. Now the next thing that we're talking about is going to be the Great Depression. The only question that can be made from Great Depression is discuss the causes and the significance or the impact of the Great Depression, that is there. Now, Great Depression is interesting also. If you have not watched two movies, I would very strongly suggest you should watch. One is a movie, the other is a documentary. Ideally, one must watch a documentary, but if you want documentary is too heavy, then you can watch the movie. That's The Big Short. The Big Short is a movie, and The Inside Job is the documentary. Big Short, I think also got nominated for the Oscars. I am not sure, but Inside Job did. Okay, and in Big Short, there's Christian Bale. Inside Job, the whole narration is by, I think, Matt Damon. So both of them are very good ones, and they are not about the Great Depression, but they're about the 2008 financial crisis. And as you will see, what we're going to discuss, it is my perception. It is my perception that we are going through a depression right now. The only thing that we don't realize that we are going through a depression right now, because in India we don't believe in collecting data. So there is no data. So where is the depression? There is Vikas. Okay. So now, see, for example, just to give you a context of poor data collection in India, Sri Lanka last year eliminated malaria. We eliminated malaria long back because we don't collect data only. Okay, so I mean that's not just for one thing. For example, for tuberculosis, the Lancet study showed that over the last decade we have underreported 25% of tuberculosis death. So आप report ही मत करिए तो problem है ही नहीं. Okay, so that's also there. So that's the problem with data collection within India even today. So, but and in the economic arena also, but that's not my job to get into. But let's talk about the Great Depression. First, you just understand there is not much need to write. We will write only briefly. I have given in the PowerPoint presentation the important points that you must know. Now, in terms of Great Depression, what is the cause of the Great Depression? Firstly, it's still a matter of debate. What is the cause? What was the cause of the Great Depression? Okay. It's still people are doing a PhD on the Great Depression of 1929. Okay, so that's there. But there are a multiple number of factors which were associated with the Great Depression, which was the initial cause. It's very difficult to figure out in this situation. But the Great Depression lasted from 1929 till 1941. The Great Depression was also the period which most strongly affected the US economy, but had a complete impact on the European economy as well. And this is also the reason why you see communism was becoming extremely popular in Western Europe as capitalism was dealing with the Great Depression. Now, what exactly happened in the Great Depression? Firstly, what you see that the two major centers were Europe and America. Now, what is happening here is, and please just understand this as one good story, where it's beginning is very difficult to say. But what happened, that's what I'm telling you. So, what is happening is that in World War I, during World War I, the European economy is completely disrupted. The European industries are completely disrupted. And because European industries are completely disrupted in World War I, European industries can't produce to meet their own demand. And so, who was meeting the demand was the American industries. And American industries were meeting the demands who found a huge market for their goods in Europe, because there was no competition from European goods at this time. Also, the Europeans did not even have money to buy the American goods. So America also gave them loans. So America also gave them loans to buy these goods. Okay, so it was giving loans also, and with these loans they were buying the American goods. So in a way, this was positive for the American economy. However, what you start seeing is that, and one of the things also to know in America at this point of time, that in America there were a number of these industries which were producing goods and they were selling it in Europe. All these industries were making profits because the European market was big. There was no competition from European industries and they kept making profits. Now, because there was a huge demand, all these industries were looking to multiply or increase their production, right? All industries were looking to increase their production because there was a mass market. And if they needed to increase their production, what did they need? Loans. They needed somebody to provide them loans. And the loans were being provided to them by the American banks. The American banks were providing them the loans. However, one of the things to know about American banks at this point of time, they were not very big banks. Okay, so the banks were relatively not of a very huge capital size. Okay, so the size of these banks was relatively small. And what happens at this time is that they have been giving these loans to these industries because these industries are making profits and they expect to make more profits in the future. And you'll find this very relatable. Any industry, if it has to expand and increase its production, it needs to invest and increase its production. For that, one of the ways to raise money is by loans. The other way to raise money is by equity or from the share market, right? So the other place, on the one side, they were raising loans from the banks. On the other side, they were tapping into the shareholders, or they were giving out these shares, and they wanted people to buy their shares, and with this they will also get money. Now the problem is that the fact was that at this point of time in US, the individual investors were merely 10% of the total share market. Okay, meaning most of the investors were institutional investors. आपने इकोनॉमी में पढ़ा होगा, foreign institutional investor होता है जैसे FII, right? So most of them were not individual investors but were institutional investors. Now what did the institutional investors do? They saw that these industries are like blue chip companies. They keep making profits. They are making more profits and profits and profits after years. So they expected them to make even more profits in the future. So they did something amazing. They had this amazing idea that let's take loans from the banks. Or these are the institutional investors. Let's take loans from the banks. And with these loans, we will buy their shares. And when they will make profits, we will also get profits. So this is where the situation is getting messier. So the banks are lending loans to the industries also, the banks are lending loans to the institutional investors also. The investors are also investing in the shares of these companies, hoping them to make more and more profits. Now, what is happening now is that industries are taking loans left, right, center. Okay, increasing their production base, and soon the production outstrips the demand in Europe. And the production started increasing also this production on the one side increased in America. On the other side, industry started reviving in Europe also. So you see, production started increasing, whereas the demand was not keeping pace. The other market for US to cater to was the American market itself. But in America, there was again something, and that was a high income inequality. 1% of the American population owned 58% of America's wealth. The result was that the rest 80% of the population had merely around 25% of America's wealth. Or there was a huge income inequality within America. And if large number of people have only a small amount of money, then their buying capacity is less, right? So this is also something which was there, that there was a huge income inequality in America, because of which the buying capacity within America was also limited. These industries were growing, mainly capturing the European market. And then one fine day, when an annual report, this is what happened. In one fine day, in one of the annual reports, the first companies in 1928 showed losses. And it was not just one company which showed loss. Soon, many other companies reported losses in their annual report. And this led to a collapse of the stock market. It led to a collapse of the stock market, where some of the market leaders showed significant losses in their annual reports as the stock market collapsed. As the stock market collapsed, so did the institutional investors. Now, the institutional investors could not pay back the loans that they had taken from the banks. As these companies started to report losses, they could not pay back the loans that they had taken from banks. And then banks also are doing what? Banks are doing what? Banks have money of whom? Of the depositors. And when banks started making losses, these banks were also not huge banks. And when they started making losses, people started to panic. And then that is where people start withdrawing their money from the banks, the bank run situation, which happened. And people started withdrawing their money from the banks. And now banks found it difficult to even pay back the people, which led even more people to withdraw from more banks. Okay? And this bank run situation led to a collapse of the American banking system. And now, as also, this does not stop here, because as production in the industries, as industries started making losses, they started laying off workers. And as workers were being laid off, because industries were no longer making profits, they started decreasing their production. To decrease their production, they laid off the workers. And when they laid off the workers, it simply meant that workers were being denied the jobs, or they were getting unemployed. And unemployed workers meaning even less buying capacity in the market. So the American market anyways was highly economically unequal. On top of that, the workers were losing out on their jobs, which meant that the buying capacity in America declined even further. And if the buying capacity is declining even further, the market for goods is declining even further. Now herein comes, this is what is interesting. You have been born and brought up reading what is the demand supply theory, right? That there is demand and there is supply. If demand is falling, so supply would also correct itself according to it, and the market will restore itself. That was the whole idea. And if that was to happen, that was okay. But that did not happen. Because as demand contracted, this demand contracted, it led to unemployment. And with unemployment, what happened? The demand contracted even further, and as demand contracted, the supply contracted, and supply contracted meant what? That more workers were laid off. This led to even bigger suppression of demand, leading to even a bigger suppression of supply, leading to even a bigger suppression of demand. So it's a chain reaction or a kind of a vicious cycle that actually worsened further and further. And from the beginning of 1928, unemployment started rising and soon increased from 12% to 25%. And by 1934, 40% unemployment was there in United States. And US was dealing with a severe economic crisis. Where it started was difficult to say, but it did impact everybody in United States. And you see that this whole logic of capitalism, that minimal state intervention was not working. Rather, it deepened the crisis even further and further. Demand and supply did not correct themselves. Rather, it was a profound mismatch that kept on worsening. And that is what is the Great Depression. Why it's called a Great Depression? Because it did not last a year or 2 years or 3 years. It lasted almost a generation of American people. From 1928, it went on to 1946. Almost 25 years, you see the Great Depression continued. And unemployment was high, wages were low, demand and prices were also high across United States. And also it had a repercussion in Europe. How? How did it have a repercussion in Europe? Is because as US industries collapsed, the banks also collapsed. And now these banks demanded that pay back our loans that you have taken from us. Europe had no money to pay back these loans. So Europe had no money to pay back these loans, and this resulted in a collapse of the European stock market also. And the collapse of the European stock market led to a ruin of the European industries, which had just started to recover from 1925-26 onwards. So European banks collapsed because they could not pay back the American banks, and as European banks collapsed, European industries also collapsed. So that's what is the Great Depression. Now, just apply this around yourself and see. 2000, you currently have a number of banks which are dealing with NPAs, and these are all NPAs that had been evergreened for a long period of time. After 2008, it's only when Raghuram Rajan cracked the whip, you see that these NPAs started coming out in the open. Montek Singh Ahluwalia kept sitting over them for a long period of time, and this was being said even then, but nobody listened. But now everybody is listening. So that's there. Now, on the one side, the banks have a huge NPAs to deal with. On the other side, you have a number of big companies who are the top 10 defaulters in India with more than 1 lakh crore debt. L&T, Larsen and Toubro, Adani, Ambani, all of them have more than 1 lakh crores of debts which they are defaulting. The day any of these companies default or declare themselves as bankrupt, if at all that was to happen in a parallel universe, will never happen. So, if at all they were to declare themselves as bankrupt, what will happen? The stock markets will collapse. If the stock markets collapse, the banks will collapse. That is the time when you should withdraw your money from the banks. Okay? Why? Because there is another bill which is being introduced right now, which is doing exactly the same thing, saying that your money will be invested in the stock market in the shares of these companies. And if these companies default, we will give you the shares. Do you get what is being said? For example, Kingfisher takes a loan of 5,000 crores from SBI. Kingfisher says we are bankrupt, we can't pay back the loan. SBI has given 5,000 crores. What does it do? It takes the money from the individual depositors. Your money which is deposited in the bank will be given in the form of loans to Kingfisher. Now that Kingfisher doesn't pay back your loan, you will be given the shares of Kingfisher, which anyways are penniless now. So that would mean that your money is not safe in the bank itself. Right? So that's one of the bills which is being proposed, but I don't think personally it will go through, because that will be the end of democracy in India as I know it. Because people will now, if they understand what is being planned here, you have 1 demonetization, 2 GST, 3 this, is not going to get down well with any government. Now, nonetheless, what is also too important to note here is actually why in India you do not see this problem, or why in India you do not realize that currently itself we are in a sort of a recession or some kind of a Great Depression, is because unemployment figures are not reported properly. 92% of the jobs are in the informal sector, where we have no data collection source. Right? So whatever labor trends we get is from the organized sector, which is mainly 8% of the employment. And just tell me one thing, when you look at the stock market keeps on increasing in India. It's reached 33,000, 31, 32,000, whatever. Your GDP growth is not increasing in any significant manner. The index of industrial production is not increasing in any significant manner, but somehow the stock markets are increasing. Okay? And why is it this happening? Is that it's partly a bubble which is waiting to burst. At the other side, also what you see is, one of the last things to actually know is how the situation can be solved in case of India, is what the government is doing is in terms of bailing out the banks. And because the banks have NPAs and the non-performing assets, because the companies are likely to say that we can't repay the loans. How does the banking system is prevented from a collapse? By bailing out the banks. Using what? Using the taxpayers' money. So banks make reckless loans to corporates default. Then you say that banks must be saved, because if banks also default, then the whole system will collapse. And thus, to save the banks, you bail out them. Now, one of the logics of capitalism is what? That the fittest will survive in the market, and which is not fit will perish, right? So if tomorrow one company is making losses, so say SpiceJet is making losses, and if SpiceJet is not good enough, it will be wiped out of the market, it will close. And if that is the same logic, it must be applied to banks as well. Those banks which are making losses, why should the government bail them out? The banks gave these loans, making their own judgment. And देखिए, आप बैंक के पास लोन लेने जाएंगे, तो आपसे बैंक will ask for each and every document, okay? And that is meant to assess your credit worthiness. But that was not done from 2008 onwards. That is why Kingfisher got a loan without any collateral, only by the name of brand Kingfisher. They got 5,000 crores of loans. So just because I say Ambani is a brand, you give me this loan. So a number of unsecured loans were extended, which has resulted in the mess in the banking sector. And now you bail them out with the taxpayers' money. If you don't bail them out, the system collapses. If you bail them out, you are what is called as socializing losses and privatizing profits. Okay. If you don't bail them out, that's also a mess. If you bail them out, that's also a mess. This is a mess that US faced in 2008 when Morgan Stanley, some of the biggest investment banks, etc., defaulted, and the government was forced to bail them out. And this led to a huge furor that why should these banks be bailed out? The argument given was that these banks are too big to fail. If they fail, the economy collapses. So we have to bail them out. So this is the whole politics behind it. And that is why the Great Depression is considered as relevant as ever. One of Raghuram Rajan's first paper in 1993 was also on the Great Depression. So it's something that every economist worth his salt studies and finds something to learn from. आप भी कुछ सीख लीजिए. Stock market में पैसा मत लगाइएगा अगले 2-3 साल. Okay, so that's it. Now ये पूरी कहानी क्यों बताई आपको? That we are going to write down the causes and we are going to write down what was done to take them out of the Great Depression. Now let's write down the causes first of the Great Depression. Yeah.
How did the economy eventually recover from that?
हम तो पहले भी इकोनॉमी को डिप्रेशन में ले जाते हैं, फिर डिप्रेशन से निकालेंगे बाद में. So how did the economy recover? We'll talk about it later. It was World War I which revived the American economy in a nutshell. It was World War II which revived the American economy in the nutshell, because again Europe was destroyed and America found a market for its goods. Okay, but there were other steps also which were taken in between that we'll talk about. Now, what you see in terms of causes of Great Depression, firstly, was a collapse of the US stock market that was witnessed in 1929 as a number of listed companies reported losses in 1929. The other cause, so the collapse of the US stock market was one of the causes. The other major cause was a reckless expansion by US industries securing cheap loans. 2008 depression in US happened kaise? They gave loans to anybody and everybody without even seeing their face to buy houses. That led to a boom in the real estate market in US. Individuals brought houses and got loans just by calling to the banks and said that we want to buy a house and please give us a loan. The banks extended the loans just like that, even without looking at the face of people. At times, one person took 6 loans from 6 different banks and bought 6 houses to sell them later and make even more money. Okay, and this is what happened. And when the bank started to collapse, everything started to collapse. Okay, which is not the case in India. इसीलिए that's what is different. आपकी दिक्कत ये है कि ना तो आपने लोन लिया, फिर भी पैसा आप ही का जाएगा. Okay, at least in US, the subprime crisis was triggered because of reckless lending to individual household buyers. Here, it is the big corporates who are defaulting on their loans, and that is leading to the collapse. Okay, that's there. So the reckless expansion by US industries securing cheap loans from US banks soon resulted in a situation where production outstripped demand in US and Europe, leading to losses for these industries. The third reason was the high income inequality in US, where the top 1% of population owned 58% of the wealth. This resulted owned 58% of the wealth. This resulted in low buying capacity amongst the working class in United States. The fourth reason was the small banks started to collapse as the companies and investors whom they had extended unsecured loans started defaulting. This led to a major public crisis and bank run kind of situation in US. Lastly, as industries collapsed, unemployment, and that's why you see that Kingfisher is only a very small fish. 5,000 crores is nothing in the larger economic scheme. When you have Ambani Ambani is the biggest with more than 1,50,000 crores of bad loans. Adani is more than 1 lakh crores. L&T has 96,000 crores. These are huge sums of money. And there's absolutely nothing, and obviously what you read in newspapers about them. Okay. One of the things you must know that Ambanis have a stake in almost all newspapers that you read, almost all news channels that you have ever thought of, also in almost all publishing houses that you will read. So one of the biggest books written, one of the best books written on Ambani was on Dhirubhai Ambani was The Polyester Prince. This book was written in 1980s, and the very next day, Ambani's bought the publishing house and took the book out of the market. Okay, so that is the reach, and that is also something why you don't know about the whole bad loan issue to the extent that must be a public issue. But Vikas and Gujarat elections and Anushka Sharma and Virat Kohli's marriage is a bigger issue. So as industries collapsed, unemployment increased in US and reached around 40% by 1934. This had an extremely negative impact on demand, worsening the Great Depression even further. Okay. Now, what is the way to tackle this? Or what happened, or what was done to tackle this? Now, there were two important US presidents, Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt, who took steps to tackle the Great Depression. And again, you don't need to write too much about what was done. I've given that, and briefly we'll write about it, not too much in detail like this. But in terms of what was done was, what is to be done? Simple hai, Narega. Okay, Narega is to be done here. That firstly, Herbert Hoover, when he came in 1929, he said that we are a capitalist state. We do not intervene in the market. The market will correct itself, and the industries must intervene. However, he soon realized that this was a terrible idea. He tried to firstly convince industries to take immediate measures. Firstly, he told industries, please do not lay off workers. Do not lower their wages, or do not lay them off. Because if you lay them off, obviously it would decrease the demand further and would worsen the crisis. And that was one thing. Then he said that corporates must start NGOs, so that they provide food, they provide ration, they provide livelihood, they even provide food and ration to people, because people did not have money to buy food also. Malnutrition increased in United States at this point of time. So he urged corporates to start NGOs, and that they must distribute free food, must not lay off workers. But soon it was realized by Herbert Hoover that the size of the problem was too large, and it could not be taken care of by the corporate sector or by some individual incentives or initiatives here and there. And that is where you see 2 years in his presidency had passed. Okay, and he realized that he is not going to win the next presidency anyways. So Hoover almost had almost accepted defeat even before contesting the next election. Okay, but nonetheless, that happens there. And by 1931, Hoover now tries a major course correction and now argues for state intervention. For the first time, the paragon of capitalism is saying that capitalism needs to be saved, and for that, state intervention is necessary. And that is why Great Depression was considered very important in the evolution of economic understanding, that markets cannot correct themselves always, and that state regulation or a strong regulation is important for capitalism to survive. And that is why Raghuram Rajan's, one of the title of his books was How to Save Capitalism from Capitalists. Okay, that unless and until capitalism is strongly regulated, then the capitalists would bring about the collapse of capitalism themselves, as was witnessed in the Great Depression. And in that context, what is argued is state intervention. So the first thing is you revive demand. And only when you revive demand can you revive the whole system. And for reviving demand, what is needed is generation of employment. And for generating employment, the state must provide employment if the private sector cannot. And that is why you see the Hoover Dam was instituted at this point of time. This was one of the first projects. आपने Transformer movie देखी है? उसमें वो एक dam है. That is the Hoover Dam. So Hoover Dam was by far the biggest hydropower dam that was constructed in US at this point of time. This was the first time then the US government had started construction of such a major project on its own, providing employment to people. This was seen as a shift where state was taking up the role to generate employment. But Hoover Dam and some other infrastructure projects were started by Hoover, but these projects were also not enough to generate significant amount of employment. Though an attempt had been made, but the size of the problem was too big that a few isolated infrastructure projects here and there were not enough to revive demand, because unemployment kept increasing and increasing. Hoover lost the next election, and you see Franklin D. Roosevelt come into power. And this is where you see the beginning of the New Deal, where Roosevelt promised that he would introduce a New Deal which will take US out of the depression. And Hoover was there till his death, after which you see the next US president coming into power, Harry S. Truman. Okay? And till Roosevelt was there, Roosevelt introduced what was the formula of 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And this is something that you can write down with me. That relief, recovery, and reform, this was the steps taken to tackle the Great Depression. I'm writing it in short. I've given some more details if you want in the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, that the first was to provide immediate relief. How do you provide immediate relief? What the American government now took was an active responsibility of providing immediate relief. Immediate relief was to be provided by opening of food distribution centers, by distributing unemployment allowances, by state-led opening of old age homes, provision for health insurance, etc. So this was to provide immediate relief to the people, to give them food, water, shelter, at least those who are unemployed, and 40% of the US population is unemployed. That means that the size of the program has to be huge. Okay. The next is recovery. And recovery was meant to do what? Recovery was meant to revive demand in the US economy. And how was the demand to be revived in the US economy? By a state-led initiative to generate employment. That is why I am saying Narega. Okay, one of the things which helped India to tackle the 2008 depression was Narega, which generated employment and kept rural demand high. Okay, so that's also there. So by a state-led initiative to generate employment. आपने जॉन मेन्यर्ड कीन्स का नाम तो सुना ही होगा, right? In economy you would have heard about the Keynesian economics. Keynes submitted his PhD thesis roughly around 1935-36, and he strongly supported this Franklin D. Roosevelt's attempt to revive the economy by generating employment, by creating sustainable infrastructure. Okay, so the public works program was started, under which a sustainable public infrastructure dams, highways, irrigation, projects. To give you a sense, also let me tell you, when the current Prime Minister came to power in 2014, in the opening budget he said that I will keep Narega alive as a symbol of the failure of the economic policies of the Congress. Because even 60 years after independence, they are giving money to people to dig holes. Okay. The next budget and the next budget, he was forced to increase the outlay for Narega rather than decreasing it, primarily because even if he would not acknowledge, there is a great crisis in the rural economy. And unless and until you do that, the economy is going to collapse and contract even further. Okay. So the sustainable public infrastructure, dams, highways, irrigation projects were to be created by state investment. This B point, this would generate employment and revive demand. For starting the public works program, an authority was set up, and this was the Tennessee Valley Authority. Just the name you must know, TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And this is being done from 1934 onwards. The public works program. Now this was to revive the economy or relief recovery, and finally was to be reform. Reform what? Reform was to be introduced so as to prevent the outbreak of another Great Depression. The reform was to reform financial institutions, to prevent the outbreak of another Great Depression. This involved the introduction of the FDIC Act. What did this act say? This act said that every individual depositor up to $2,000 who are putting their money in bank, their money is secured by the US government. Even if the banks collapse, any individual depositor, जैसे इस एक्ट में कहा जा रहा है कि 1 लाख रुपए तक आपका पैसा सुरक्षित है, अगर उसके ऊपर गया तो फिर आप जो है देख लीजिए. So involved the introduction of the FDIC Act, which was to secure individual deposits up till $2,000. Also, consolidation of the banking system was proposed. Also, consolidation of the banking system was proposed. Okay. So, all of these, so that small banks ki jagah we should have big banks, because big banks can shoulder the losses better than small banks. Okay, that's what was the idea. All these were introduced. There are a few more points that we have to write. We'll do it in the next class so that you don't die here only. So, right? And in the next class, we'll talk about the period leading to World War II. We'll also talk about Japan. okay, and military fascism in Japan, and the events and the causes of World War II.